The sound of splintering wood still echoes in my head. One second, I'm sitting in my grandfather's cabin sipping a cold beer with none other than the state attorney general of our state, and the next, bam, my front door explodes off its hinges like a battering ram just hit it. And who comes storming in? Not the police, not some escaped convict. It's her, the HOA president, Karen Cromwell herself, heels clicking across the broken glass like she's marching into a boardroom. Expensive blazer, cloud of perfume that hits harder than pepper spray, and a face twisted in self-righteous fury. She's live streaming the entire thing to her followers, screaming about violations and jurisdiction like she's the sheriff of this lake. Only problem? She just barged into private property, my property, and committed half a dozen felonies in front of the one man in this country who can put her away for decades. I sat there in stunned silence, watching her dig her own grave in real time. The Attorney General set his beer down slowly, his eyes narrowing as Karen waved papers in the air like they were holy scripture. She had no idea who he was, no idea what kind of hammer was about to drop on her little empire. And let me tell you, by the end of that night, Karen Cromwell's life would never be the same again. But here's the kicker. That wasn't just a random outburst. No. This insane, door-kicking meltdown was the climax of 6 straight months of harassment, threats, lawsuits, and schemes that turned our peaceful lakeside community into a war zone. A war that ended with Karen in handcuffs, her pearl-white Escalade towed away, and a fraud empire worth millions going up in smoke. So how the hell did we get from me enjoying the quiet retirement my grandfather dreamed of, to an HOA tyrant literally kicking my door down in front of the Attorney General? Let me rewind. The story of Clearwater Lake really begins long before the day Karen Cromwell kicked down my cabin door, long before the flashing red and blue lights illuminated her pearl-white Escalade, and long before federal agents clicked the cuffs around her wrists. To understand the sheer chaos that woman unleashed on our quiet corner of paradise, you need to know what this place meant to me, and what it had already survived before Karen came sniffing around. My cabin wasn't just a patch of wood and shingles sitting on the lakeshore. It was Pop's dream. Built by his hands after the war, it stood as both a retreat and a reminder of the values he lived by: independence, honesty, and the quiet dignity of hard work. Pop believed that life's worth wasn't measured in HOA-approved lawns or paint colors, but in sunsets across the lake and neighbors you could count on when storms hit. For decades, that philosophy held Clearwater together. Families helped each other build docks, patch roofs, and haul in firewood. We didn't need a board or a committee to dictate how we lived. We had trust. That trust cracked the day Karen and her entourage rolled into town. At first, people thought the Cromwells were just another well-off couple looking for a weekend retreat. Their Escalades sparkled like a trophy, their clothes screamed boutique catalogs, and their smiles were all teeth and no warmth. But what set Karen apart was the way she surveyed everything, as if the lake, the cabins, and even the people were items on her personal checklist of things to control. Within weeks, she and Robert Cromwell positioned themselves at the center of the local HOA, a body that had been little more than a formality for years. Suddenly, meetings that once ended with potluck dinners turned into tense debates where Karen slammed her fist on the table over paint swatches, dock dimensions, and lawn care standards. It wasn't enough for her to enforce the existing rules. She invented new ones: fines for solar panels that ruined the natural aesthetic, citations for dock chairs that posed safety hazards, and of course threats of demolition for cabins, like mine, that she claimed were eyesores dragging down property values. I'll admit, I tried to ignore her at first. Retired life had taught me the value of patience, and I figured she'd burn herself out eventually. But Karen wasn't just some nitpicky neighbor. She was relentless. She had a flair for turning molehills into mountains and then charging everyone a toll for the privilege of crossing. The woman lived for conflict the way most of us lived for summer barbecues. The day she first marched up my dock in those high heels, click, 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 like gunshots on the planks, I knew ignoring her wasn't going to cut it. She stood there, waving a stack of citations like a badge of honor, and told me my cabin violated at least 6 newly adopted HOA standards. My solar panels, which had been powering my cabin cleanly for years, were suddenly deemed hazardous. My dock, which Pop and I had reinforced 3 summers earlier, was unsafe and marked for removal. Even my porch chairs, for crying out loud, were targeted as non-compliant. That's when I realized Karen wasn't just harassing me, she was laying the groundwork for something bigger. Neighbors started whispering. Fines rolled in faster than summer storms. Families that had lived here for decades found themselves threatened with liens, foreclosure, and forced sales. And all the while, Karen strutted around like a queen surveying her domain, backed by her husband Robert's political connections. People were scared, not just of losing their homes, but of crossing a woman who seemed untouchable. But here's the thing about Clearwater Lake. It doesn't take kindly to bullies. Pop used to say, the lake remembers who respects it and who doesn't. Watching Karen treat our home like her personal fiefdom lit a fire in me I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't just defending my solar panels or my dock. I was defending Pop's legacy, my neighbor's peace of mind, and the very spirit of our community. So I did what any stubborn old man with time on his hands and justice in his heart would do. I started digging. What began as a stack of neatly organized HOA letters on my kitchen table soon turned into a mountain of evidence spread across binders, folders, and flash drives. Late nights turned into early mornings as I traced Karen's bogus fines, fraudulent accounting practices, and suspicious connections to contractors who just happened to benefit from her enforcement campaigns. And the deeper I dug, the clearer it became. Karen wasn't just abusing her neighbors. She was running a full-blown criminal enterprise under the guise of community management. At that point, I had 2 choices: roll over, pay the fines, and pray she left me alone, or fight back with everything I had. And if you've been paying attention, you already know which one I chose. The first real crack in Karen's armor appeared one muggy afternoon in July. I was standing on my dock, repairing one of the cleats, when I overheard her barking at Mr. Henderson, a retired Navy man who'd lived 2 lots down for over 20 years. She had a clipboard in one hand and that signature scowl plastered on her face, accusing him of improperly stored equipment because his canoe was pulled up on shore instead of hanging on some HOA-approved rack. Henderson wasn't a man to scare easily, but I could see the frustration in his eyes. He argued that his canoe had been resting there for decades without issue. Karen, of course, wasn't as interested in reason. She wanted compliance, power, and above all, submission. When she threatened him with daily fines, Henderson muttered something about lawyers and walked away. But I caught the look she gave him, like a wolf watching a sheep stray too far from the flock. That was when I knew I wasn't alone in this fight. Over the next few weeks, more stories trickled in. Mrs. Patterson, a widow in her 70s, got hit with a $200 fine for having unauthorized flowers planted along her walkway. The Williams family received a demolition order for their shed, conveniently right before Robert Cromwell's buddy, a local developer, put in a bid to purchase their property at a suspiciously low price. And then there were the endless threats mailed in heavy certified envelopes, each one more intimidating than the last. It became painfully obvious. Karen wasn't just nitpicking, she was engineering financial distress. Every unjust fine, every trumped-up violation, it all fed into a scheme designed to push people off their land so Karen's associates could scoop it up at bargain prices. That realization made me furious. But here's the thing, I knew better than to confront her head-on. Karen thrived on public conflict, twisting words and wielding her clipboard like a sword. She wanted screaming matches because then she could paint herself as the victim, just enforcing the rules. No, I couldn't beat her on her battlefield. I needed a different strategy. So I went back to basics. I started attending every single HOA meeting, not to argue, but to document. I recorded her speeches, wrote down every bylaw change, and kept copies of every piece of correspondence. When neighbors whispered their frustrations, I encouraged them to send me copies of their fines and notices. Slowly but surely, I built a dossier that even Karen couldn't wave away. Of course, she noticed. She always noticed. One night, I came back from a supply run to find my lock cut clean through. My cabin door stood ajar, and inside, my files had been rifled through. Nothing was stolen, at least not obviously, but it was clear someone had been searching for the evidence I'd been gathering. The violation notices, the financial spreadsheets, the contractor invoices I'd copied, they were all still there, but now with greasy fingerprints smeared across them. I didn't need Sherlock Holmes to figure out who was behind it. That break-in crossed a line. Karen had moved from harassment to outright intimidation, and that told me one very important thing. I was close. Too close for her comfort. If she was willing to bust into my cabin to try to shake me up, then the evidence I had was worth protecting. So I doubled down. I bought a small fireproof safe and locked the most sensitive documents inside. I backed everything up digitally on encrypted drives. And most importantly, I reached out to someone outside the community, someone who had the authority to act. The State Attorney General's office. Now, before you think I went in guns blazing, let me be clear. I didn't march into their office with a smoking gun. That would have been reckless. Instead, I started small. I contacted their Consumer Protection Division anonymously, just to test the waters. I explained the pattern of fraudulent fines, the suspicious connections with developers, and the intimidation tactics. To my surprise, they didn't dismiss me. They asked for details, names, dates, documents. That's when I realized this wasn't just a neighborhood feud anymore. This was a case, a real one. And if I played it right, Karen's empire of control was about to start crumbling from the inside out. But Karen wasn't done escalating, not by a long shot. Because a woman like her, she doesn't back down when she senses resistance. She doubles down. And the storm she unleashed next would test every ounce of resolve I had. By August, Karen had transformed our once quiet HOA meetings into three-ring circuses. What used to be 10 neighbors sipping coffee in folding chairs had ballooned into tense gatherings packed with new members, most of them suspiciously tied to her real estate cronies. She strutted in wearing those same pearl heels, carrying a leather binder thick enough to crush a man's dreams, and delivered her proclamations like a queen addressing her subjects. Effective immediately, she announced one sticky Thursday night, all waterfront properties must conform to updated dock standards. Non-compliant structures will be removed at the owner's expense. My stomach dropped. She didn't even look at me, but everyone knew exactly whose dock she was gunning for. Henderson's too, and the Millers down the shore. But here's the kicker. These new standards just happen to mirror the designs of a dock company owned by, you guessed it, her husband's business partner. Anyone failing to pay for approved upgrades would be fined into oblivion until they either sold or caved. I sat there, pretending to scribble notes, while my blood boiled. Neighbors muttered in frustration, but nobody dared raise their hand. Karen had a way of shutting down dissent with that icy stare of hers, the kind that made you feel like a child caught stealing cookies. Not me, though. I stood up, calm as you please, and asked, "Madam President, could you clarify when this bylaw was voted into effect? I don't recall seeing it on last month's agenda." Her smile was thin as razor wire. "The board approved it in a closed session. You should know that bylaws allow for emergency measures." There it was, the lie I'd been waiting for. According to the HOA's own charter, emergency sessions could only address safety hazards, not cosmetic upgrades. And best of all, I had last month's meeting minutes recorded, word for word. No mention of dock standards, no vote, nothing. That night, after the meeting broke up, Henderson pulled me aside. His face was red with anger. "Marcus, this is theft, plain and simple. We can't let her do this." I nodded. "We won't." From that moment on, our quiet resistance became an alliance. Henderson, the Millers, Mrs. Patterson. We formed what I half-jokingly called the Dockside Defenders. Every time Karen tried to slip in a new rule or intimidate a neighbor, we documented it. Henderson used his Navy training to diagram timelines of her decisions. Mrs. Patterson, bless her, dug into property tax records at the county office and uncovered a web of shell companies buying up foreclosed cabins. And me? I became the archivist, keeping everything organized in binders so thick they could stop a bullet. Of course, Karen smelled resistance like a bloodhound. She started showing up unannounced on my property, snapping photos of my solar panels, my septic system, even the grill I used on weekends. One morning, I caught her crouched in my garden, measuring the distance between my tomatoes and the property line with a tape measure. When I stepped outside, she jumped like a burglar caught red-handed, then snarled, "Violation. Vegetable gardens must not exceed 200 square feet. That rule doesn't exist," I shot back. "It does now," she hissed. Every fiber in my being wanted to explode, but I remembered Pop's wisdom. Never wrestle with a pig. You both get dirty, and the pig likes it. So I smiled, turned on my heel, and went back inside. Meanwhile, my phone, already recording, captured the entire exchange. But Karen's paranoia only grew. Word spread that she'd installed cameras near the community entrance. She began demanding access to personal bank statements from anyone behind on dues, claiming it was standard verification. When neighbors balked, she slapped them with liens so fast the ink barely had time to dry. By then, I'd sent my first packet of evidence to the Attorney General's office. Copies of fraudulent citations, audio recordings of meetings, even photos of Karen trespassing on private property. 2 weeks later, I got the call that changed everything. A calm voice on the other end introduced himself as Special Investigator Daniel Carter. "Mr. Henley, we've reviewed your materials. It appears you may have stumbled onto something much larger than a simple HOA dispute. Would you be willing to meet in person?" I didn't hesitate. "When and where?" Carter chuckled. "Soon, and somewhere private. For now, keep doing what you're doing. The more rope she gives us, the tighter the noose." I hung up, staring at the lake as twilight settled over the water. For the first time in months, I felt hope stirring in my chest. But I also knew Karen wasn't done tightening her grip. And the next card she played would drag me straight into a storm I wasn't sure I could weather. It didn't take long for Karen to escalate. Like a shark that smells blood in the water, she went after me harder than ever once she sensed I was slipping out of her control. The morning after my call with Investigator Carter, I woke up to find a bright orange citation taped to my cabin door. Violation. Unauthorized solar installations. Fine. $1,500. I stood there in my pajamas, coffee steaming in my hand, staring at that ridiculous notice. Unauthorized? My solar panels had been approved by the county 3 years earlier, inspected twice, and grandfathered into state renewable energy guidelines. Karen didn't have the authority to overrule that, but she was banking on intimidation, not legality. I crumpled the paper and tossed it in the fire pit. But it wasn't just me. By the end of the week, Henderson got slapped with a $900 dock safety fine. Mrs. Patterson's flower beds, a beloved feature that had won local gardening awards, were suddenly deemed ecological hazards. Even the Millers, who kept their property so pristine you could eat off their porch, were cited for excessive seasonal decor because of a 4th of July flag. Karen wasn't just enforcing rules, she was declaring war, and she had backup. 2 new board members, both real estate agents, miraculously appeared at the next meeting, voting in lockstep with every motion she proposed. Together, they formed a block of authority that bulldozed over any dissent. But what Karen didn't realize was that her arrogance was creating cracks in her own fortress. Neighbors who had once been too afraid to speak started whispering to me in confidence. A single mom who'd nearly lost her cabin to foreclosure admitted that Karen's legal notices had been riddled with errors. An elderly veteran showed me bank records proving he'd paid his dues on time despite Karen's claim of delinquency. I collected everything, binder after binder. Late at night, I scanned documents by lantern light, the soft hum of my solar batteries powering the little war room I'd built in Pop's old workshop. That's when Henderson leaned across the table one evening and said, "You know she's going to make a mistake, right? People like her always do. And when she does, you'll have her dead to rights." He was right, but I didn't have to wait long. It was early September when Karen made her boldest move yet. I came back from a morning fishing trip to find the padlock on my dock storage shed cut clean through. The doors hung open, tools scattered, and standing there like she owned the place was Karen herself. She held a clipboard in one manicure, red hand snapping photos with the other. "This structure is condemned," she announced without looking up. my fists clenched. "You broke into my shed." "Correction," she said smoothly. "I conducted an emergency inspection. Your equipment poses a safety hazard to the community. This entire dock is slated for demolition." That was it. The line she'd crossed wasn't just a property dispute. It was criminal trespass. And she had no idea that my trail cameras had captured her entire little inspection, bolt cutters and all. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply said, "Thank you, Karen," and walked back inside. That evening, I packaged the footage and shipped it straight to Investigator Carter. His reply came faster than I expected. "This is gold," his email read. "Do not confront her further. We're moving to the next stage. Prepare for a visit." A visit? From who, exactly? The answer came 3 days later when a sleek black SUV pulled into my gravel driveway. Two men in suits stepped out, flashing credentials so quickly I barely had time to read them. One introduced himself as Carter, the other as Assistant U.S. Attorney Williamson. The Attorney General himself would be joining us shortly. I remember laughing, half disbelief, half relief, as Carter explained, "Mr. Henley, you're not just dealing with a power-hungry HOA president. You're sitting in the middle of a fraud operation with tentacles across the county, and with your cooperation, we intend to cut the head off this snake." As if on cue, another vehicle crunched down my drive. Out stepped a tall man in a tailored suit, eyes sharp as hawks, posture radiating authority. He extended his hand. "Attorney General Williamson," he said, "I hear you've got quite a story for me." Inside my cabin, with the lake glimmering beyond the window, I laid out my binders, recordings, and evidence across the table. Williamson studied everything carefully, nodding with each revelation. By the time we were done, he closed the last binder, steepled his fingers, and said words that sent a chill down my spine. "Mr. Henley, you haven't just exposed a corrupt HOA president. You've uncovered the entry point to a statewide fraud ring, and if we play this right, you'll be the key witness who brings it all down." And that's when it hit me. This wasn't a neighborhood squabble anymore. This was war. The gravity of what Williamson said sank in slowly, like an anchor settling into the lake bed. I'd started this fight just trying to keep Karen off my porch, and now I was apparently the linchpin in a fraud case that could ripple across the state. "Fraud ring?" I repeated, my voice catching somewhere between disbelief and fury. Williamson nodded. "Your HOA president has been funneling homeowners' money through shell accounts. Kickbacks, falsified invoices, inflated fines, all tied to development interests that want to flip this lake into high-end resorts. We've been watching the smoke for months. You just handed us the fire." I sat back, staring out the cabin window at the same lake where Pop had taught me to fish. It seemed impossible that our quiet paradise had become the epicenter of a criminal conspiracy. Carter leaned forward. "Here's the problem. We can't just swoop in and arrest her today. We need a clean chain of evidence, something undeniable. Right now, your footage of her breaking into the shed is strong, but to connect her to the money trail, we'll need more." "What do you need from me?" I asked. Williamson's eyes fixed on me, calm but sharp. "You keep doing what you've been doing. Document, record, save everything. Don't let on that we're involved. And most importantly, don't lose your temper. People like Karen are their own worst enemies. She will overreach again." I swallowed hard. And if she does? That's when we strike. For the next few weeks, life at the cabin turned into a strange, dual existence. On the surface, I went about my days, chopping wood, fishing, repairing the dock, trying to project the image of a man too stubborn to move. Beneath the surface, every interaction with Karen became evidence. I wore a body camera hidden in my shirt pocket. I scanned every letter she taped to my door. I logged the times her cronies cruised by in their SUVs, snapping photos of my property like vultures circling a carcass. The neighbors rallied quietly. Henderson, God bless him, turned his garage into a kind of underground hub. We called it the Safe House. Every week, a handful of us would gather there. Mrs. Patterson with her box of fraudulent citations, the Millers with financial statements showing bogus charges, and a few brave souls who'd finally decided they'd had enough of Karen's reign of terror. I'd lay out the latest correspondence, and we'd all laugh at the absurdity before the laughter died into grim silence. Henderson would always say the same thing: "Every empire looks untouchable until the day it collapses." The collapse started on a Tuesday afternoon. Karen rolled up in her pearl-white Escalade, her vanity plate reading Rule 1, as if she needed to remind the world who she thought she was. She strutted down my dock in her designer heels, clipboard in hand, sunglasses perched like a crown. "Mr. Henley," she began in that condescending tone, "we've reached the end of our patience. The board has voted unanimously to condemn your cabin. You have 30 days to vacate before demolition begins." I stared at her, stone-faced. "On what authority?" "On the authority of the Clearwater Lake Homeowners Association," she declared. "Failure to comply will result in liens against your property, seizure of assets, and escalation to county enforcement." Little did she know, the tiny microphone in my shirt pocket was capturing every word. I didn't argue. I didn't shout. I just asked, "You're saying you have the legal authority to condemn my property and seize my assets?" She smirked. "That's correct. And trust me, Mr. Henley, resistance will only make things worse." The recording was damning. HOA boards don't have the power to condemn homes or seize assets. Only courts and municipalities do. Karen had just crossed from intimidation into outright fraud and extortion. That night, in Henderson's garage, we played the audio for the group. Gasps filled the room. Mrs. Patterson actually clapped her hands. "She just buried herself," she whispered. I packaged the recording and sent it straight to Carter. His reply came back within hours. "This is the nail. Sit tight. The AG's office is preparing the next step. Whatever happens, don't engage with her directly anymore." Easier said than done, because Karen wasn't done with me yet. 2 days later, I woke to flashing lights outside my cabin, county sheriff cruisers. For a moment, my heart dropped. I thought the feds had abandoned me, that Karen had won. Then I saw her. Karen, standing at the edge of my dock, shrieking at the deputies, waving her clipboard like it was a royal decree. "He's trespassing on condemned property," she shouted. "Arrest him! Remove him immediately!" The deputies looked unimpressed, but the scene was drawing attention. Neighbors came out of their cabins, phones recording. Henderson stood beside me, arms crossed. I whispered, "Get this on camera. Every second of it." Karen, red-faced and shaking with fury, turned to me and hissed, "This is the end for you, Henley. I'm untouchable. My husband's already making calls downtown. You'll be gone by the weekend." But she was wrong. Because even as she spewed threats, even as the deputies tried to calm her down, I saw Carter's SUV rolling up my drive again. Only this time, he wasn't alone. And when Attorney General Williamson stepped out with a file in hand, Karen's smile faltered for the first time. The entire scene froze as Williamson approached. Even the deputies seemed to straighten their posture. Karen, however, couldn't help herself. "Who are you supposed to be?" she snapped, hands on her hips, trying to maintain her Queen of the Lake posture. Williamson didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His calm authority rolled across the dock like a thunderclap. "Margaret Collins, correct? Acting president of the Clearwater Lake Homeowners Association?" Karen blinked, caught off guard that this stranger knew her full name. "Yes, and who exactly are you barging into my community?" "I'm Attorney General Williamson," he said evenly, holding up his credentials. "And this is a criminal investigation." The color drained from her face so quickly it was almost comical. For a moment, she stammered, looking back at the deputies as if to find some support, but the deputies were already stepping away from her, eyes fixed on Williamson. This is private property. You have no authority here," she blurted, voice cracking. "Actually," Williamson replied, flipping open a folder, "I have full authority here, including warrants. We've been investigating financial crimes tied to this HOA, and thanks to recent recordings," he glanced at me briefly, "we now have probable cause." Gasps rippled from the neighbors watching along the shoreline. Phones were out everywhere, recording every second. Karen's facade cracked. "This is outrageous. My husband will put an end to this. Do you know who you're dealing with?" "Yes," Williamson said, his eyes locking onto hers. "A board president who has exceeded her legal authority, engaged in harassment, and funneled association funds into fraudulent accounts. Margaret Collins, you are under investigation for wire fraud, racketeering, and conspiracy to commit extortion." Her jaw dropped. "You can't do this." But the deputies, who only moments earlier she'd tried to command, were now standing behind her, hands hovering over their cuffs. I didn't move. I just Saint stood there on the dock, arms folded, as Karen spun around, pointing at me. He's the criminal. He's trespassing. He's defaming me. The deputies didn't flinch. Williamson stepped closer, lowering his voice, but making sure every camera caught it. Ma'am, this is the moment where you can choose to cooperate. Or you can continue this performance in front of half the county. I'd advise the former. Karen's breathing grew shallow. She clutched her clipboard like a shield, her knuckles whitening. But instead of quieting down, she exploded. This is all a setup. You don't know the kind of power my husband has. We own this lake. We decide who stays and who goes. That was it. Williamson nodded once. The deputies moved in. Karen shrieked as the cuffs clicked around her wrists, her expensive bracelets clattering onto the dock. She kicked her heels against the boards, yelling about lawsuits and vendettas, but no one was listening anymore. The neighbors were, and they cheered. Not polite applause, genuine, cathartic cheering. Mrs. Patterson was crying, shouting, "Finally!" Henderson let out a laugh so loud it echoed across the water. And me? I just stood there, soaking it all in. The sound of Karen's voice, shrill and panicked, was the sweetest music I'd ever heard. Williamson leaned toward me quietly. This is just the start. We'll need you at a deposition, and possibly a grand jury. Can you handle that? I nodded. After what she's put us through, try and stop me. But as Karen was led up the dock, still screaming about her husband fixing everything, Williamson said something that sent a chill through me. Her husband's hands aren't clean either, and when he goes down, this whole network goes with him. For the first time, I realized this wasn't just about one power-drunk HOA president. This was bigger, much bigger, and the fight wasn't over yet. That night, after the dust settled, I sat on the porch with a lantern glowing beside me, replaying everything in my head. The crack of the door breaking, the look on Karen's face when Williamson said his title, the roar of neighbors finally letting loose after years of being steamrolled by her bogus citations. It felt surreal, like a scene ripped straight out of a courtroom drama, except this wasn't TV, this was my life, my cabin, my lake. The deputies had carted Karen off in the back of a cruiser, and Williamson left with 2 thick evidence boxes, files, receipts, even a laptop pulled from Karen's Escalade. The whole HOA board had scattered like roaches when the lights come on. I watched them go, their cars peeling out, taillights bouncing down the gravel road. Not one of them looked me in the eye. But I wasn't celebrating just yet, because Williamson's words about Karen's husband kept gnawing at me. If she was this dangerous on her own, what kind of storm was brewing with him in the mix? The next morning, I didn't have to wonder. I woke up to the sound of engines. Not just one, several. Through the mist rising off the lake, I saw a caravan of black SUVs crawling up the dirt road like a funeral procession, the kind you only see in political scandals on the news. The doors opened, and out stepped Robert Cromwell, Karen's husband. I'd only ever seen him once before, during one of their HOA town halls. Back then, he'd sat in the back like a shadow, letting his wife command the room. But now, in a tailored navy suit and polished shoes that had never seen mud, he carried himself like a man who expected the ground to part for him. He wasn't alone. Behind him came 2 aides in matching suits, carrying briefcases, whispering into earpieces. This wasn't just some spouse coming to bail out his wife. This was a power move. Robert adjusted his tie, scanned the crowd of neighbors who had gathered again, and gave a rehearsed smile. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice smooth as butter, "I regret the unfortunate misunderstanding that took place yesterday. My wife has always acted in the best interest of this community, and rest assured, this matter will be resolved swiftly." The gall of this guy, he spoke like his wife hadn't just been cuffed and hauled away in front of the entire lake, like we hadn't all watched her crumble under the weight of real authority. Then his eyes found me. He walked straight up my dock, polished shoes clicking where her heels had stomped just a day before. Standing inches from me, he extended his hand like we were old friends. "Marcus Henley," he said smoothly, "you've caused quite a stir." I didn't take his hand. "Your wife broke into my cabin. That's not a stir, that's a felony." His smile didn't falter, but his eyes went cold. Careful with your words. You've inserted yourself into matters you don't fully understand. My advice? Step back. Let the system handle this. Otherwise, he let the sentence hang there, but the implication was clear as the sunrise. Otherwise, what? He turned, addressing the neighbors now. Clearwater Lake deserves better than this chaos. Once Karen is cleared of these ridiculous accusations, we'll resume our vision, transforming this community into the upscale destination it deserves to be. Higher property values, modern amenities, security, not shacks with illegal solar panels and collapsing docks dragging us all down. The neighbors booed, loudly. Some even shouted at him to leave, but Robert only raised his hands like a preacher soothing his congregation. Patience, he said, smile sharp as a blade. Justice always prevails. As he walked back to his SUV, I realized something that made my stomach knot. Karen was a tyrant, sure, but Robert was the puppeteer, and unlike her, he knew exactly how deep this rabbit hole went. Williamson was right. This wasn't over. Not even close. The days that followed Robert's visit were some of the strangest I'd ever lived through. It was like the whole lake community was split down the middle, half of us buzzing with hope that Karen's reign of terror was finally over, the other half nervously whispering that Robert was too connected, too powerful, and that somehow, some way, the Cromwells would wriggle out of this. I wasn't sure which half I belonged to. On one hand, I'd seen Karen arrested in real time. No amount of smooth talking was going to erase the sight of her in cuffs being shoved into the back of a cruiser. But on the other hand, I couldn't ignore the fact that Robert moved like a man with insurance policies hidden in every corner of the state. His confidence wasn't bravado, it was strategy. The first real sign came that Friday. I'd just finished chopping wood when a certified letter arrived in my mailbox. Not a handwritten note from a neighbor, not a bill, a full-on legal document with embossed seals. Inside was a lawsuit, Cromwell versus Henley. They were suing me for defamation, damages to Karen's reputation, interference with contractual obligations, and, get this, trespassing on my own land. Apparently, the HOA had filed some paperwork months ago trying to reinterpret property boundaries around the lake. And now Robert was using that as ammo to claim my dock and part of my shoreline belonged to the association. I laughed when I read it. Then I read it again, slower, and realized it wasn't a joke. The man was playing hardball. By sunset, 3 other families had received similar letters. The Hendersons, the Pattersons, the Lees. All targeted, all accused of violations that suddenly carried civil penalties. Robert was leveraging the HOA's charter to choke out anyone who dared speak against them. When I told Williamson about it, he wasn't surprised. He sat back in his chair, sipping coffee, and said, "Classic tactic. They're trying to intimidate you into silence before trial. Don't bite." Easy for him to say. He had a team of state attorneys behind him. I had a weathered log cabin and a file cabinet full of old property deeds. The days that followed Robert's visit were some of the strangest I'd ever lived through. It was like the whole lake community was split down the middle, half of us buzzing with hope that Karen's reign of terror was finally over, the other half nervously whispering that Robert was too connected, too powerful, and that somehow, some way, the Cromwells would wriggle out of this. I wasn't sure which half I belonged to. On one hand, I'd seen Karen arrested in real time. No amount of smooth talking was going to erase the sight of her in cuffs being shoved into the back of a cruiser. But on the other hand, I couldn't ignore the fact that Robert moved like a man with insurance policies hidden in every corner of the state. His confidence wasn't bravado, it was strategy. The first real sign came that Friday. I'd just finished chopping wood when a certified letter arrived in my mailbox. Not a handwritten note from a neighbor, not a bill. A full-on legal document with embossed seals. Inside was a lawsuit, Cromwell versus Henley. They were suing me for defamation, damages to Karen's reputation, interference with contractual obligations, and, get this, trespassing on my own land. Apparently, the HOA had filed some paperwork months ago trying to reinterpret property boundaries around the lake, and now Robert was using that as ammo to claim my dock, and part of my shoreline belonged to the association. I laughed when I read it. Then I read it again, slower, and realized it wasn't a joke. The man was playing hardball. By sunset, 3 other families had received similar letters: the Hendersons, the Pattersons, the Lees. All targeted, all accused of violations that suddenly carried civil penalties. Robert was leveraging the HOA's charter to choke out anyone who dared speak against them. When I told Williamson about it, he wasn't surprised. He sat back in his chair, sipping coffee, and said, "Classic tactic. They're trying to intimidate you into silence before trial. Don't bite." Easy for him to say. He had a team of state attorneys behind him. I had a weathered log cabin and a file cabinet full of old property deeds. That night, the neighbors gathered on my porch again. We didn't plan it, it just happened. Word traveled fast on the lake, and by the time the moon rose, nearly a dozen people were crammed onto my porch and the steps, holding letters identical to mine. The mood was tense, angry, scared. "They're trying to take everything," Mrs. Patterson whispered, clutching her envelope like it was radioactive. "My cabin's been in my family since the 50s. They can't just—" "They can try," I interrupted, "but that doesn't mean they'll win." The group fell silent, all eyes on me. I wasn't a leader. I wasn't some politician or lawyer. I was just a retired lineman who wanted to fish in peace. But at that moment, staring at the fear in their eyes, I realized I didn't have a choice. Someone had to stand up, and for better or worse, that someone was me. "They want us divided," I told them. "They want us scared and quiet. But we've got something they don't: truth, history, and each other. My grandfather's deeds, your family's records, the fact that this lake existed decades before Karen ever rolled in with her Escalade. That's our shield. And if Robert wants a fight, then we give him one, together." For the first time all week, I saw hope replace fear in their faces. Heads nodded, murmurs of agreement rose like the wind through the pines. And that was the moment I knew this wasn't just my battle anymore. It was our battle. The Cromwells might have money, power, and political ties, but we had something they'd never understand: community. And no matter how dark the nights ahead would be, I promised myself one thing: they would never take this lake from us.